It's June, the temps are soaring, and most of the fish are done spawning. What does that mean? We're headed into crankbait season, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. You can check them out at sportsmans.com or visit them at any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Guys, it's hot outside. It was 90 plus degrees at my house at almost 6,000 feet in elevation the last couple of days. It's been even hot at night. I'm sleeping outside at night at this point, which is, by the way, not to get sidetracked, but it's something I highly recommend you do if you have the opportunity. I'm lucky where I live. I sleep outside and sleep on the deck under the stars, and it's very, very nice. I consider that a blessing. I can hear the fish splashing around, the carp splashing around in there overnight while they're spawning, and the foxes barking. It's a pretty great time of year all the way around. It's hot, but it's not midsummer yet, so we're still headed for that. But what I know is in our travels, once we start getting water temps in this range and the bass are coming off their spawn, walleyes are long since done spawning, there's still a lot of shallow fish up feeding shallow. And for me, that means winding something a lot. And when I mean winding something I can literally just throw and wind. And it may not be quite that easy. We're not going to narrow it down to quite that easy, but at the end of the day, that's basically what we're talking about. And that could be anything from a crankbait to a swim bait of some kind to a spinner bait or a bladed jig of some kind. There's lots of different things you can wind, but one of the most versatile in terms of multi-species, and one that I lean on heavily as a guy who has guided on basically rock specific lakes for a long time, is a crankbait. And crankbaits can be one of the easiest things for an angler to learn. But there's still a ton of nuances to them. And I've been in the boat with some very, very good crankbait fishermen, and you will see that there's definitely nuances. They don't just throw a crankbait out there and wind it in. There's a lot of nuances to it. So I thought it'd be worth talking about that. Again, as with a lot of our podcasts, it's going to be multi-species oriented because a crankbait will catch you a lot of different species of fish. And that's something to keep in mind. That's a huge thing for me. I'm not much of a fan of anything that's pigeonholed to one style of fish, or one species of fish, I should say. So I like the multi-species aspect. And crankbaits certainly fit that bill. So we're going to break it down into a couple of different scenarios first. And the first thing I want to talk about is the equipment itself. If you're a bass guy, walleye guy, or boater in general, you may already have specialized equipment. And if you don't, a crankbait is one of the few rods that I feel like, or a crankbait is one of the few lures, I should say, that is best served with specialized equipment, right? So there's a lot of baits that don't matter a whole bunch. You can use a multi-purpose, to use an example, every bass guy has got a 7-foot medium heavy fast rod, and you can do a lot of stuff with that, including throw a crankbait in some scenarios. But if you really want to be good with a crankbait, there's a few things that'll help you a whole bunch when it comes to that rod. And as versatile as crankbaiting is, my crankbait rods are always in the boat. There's no doubt about it. They're in the boat from early in the year, like earliest part of the year, all the way until the very end of the year. If there's any chance that I'm going to fish, say, 20 feet or shallower, 20 feet deep or shallower, there's going to be a crankbait on. There's a few instances where I'll push that boundary on the deep side, but not many. Most of the time I'm going to be fishing crankbaits, say 15 to 0 feet deep. And a couple things. We'll start with the rod. I always say start with the lure, then pick the line, then pick the rod. And with a crankbait, I guess we should go ahead and run that same scenario since I'm the guy that preaches it first. Most of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, my crankbaits are thrown on fluorocarbon. And the reason they're thrown on fluorocarbon is because fluorocarbon has less stretch than monofilament. And why that matters is because stretch leads to insensitivity. If my line is very stretchy, I can't feel what my crankbait is doing, for one. And that's really important when it comes to not getting snagged with your crankbait. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the techniques themselves. But the stretchier the line is, the more chance you're going to snag that crankbait because you can't feel what it's doing. And knowing the difference between it ticking off rocks and a bass that got it is much helpful with a line that has less stretch to it. So that's one reason why fluorocarbon. For two, fluorocarbon has higher abrasion resistance. And since you are going to be winding this thing, and I've already alluded to the fact that there's a good shot it's going to be bouncing off rocks and things like that. And if it's not, you're going to catch as many fish. It's going to beat up your line a little bit. So having abrasion resistance is an important thing as well when it comes to crankbaits. Can be very important. Also shock resistance, because you're winding the bait in a lot of cases at a relatively high speed, and then a big fish smacks it and turns away with it. Well, that's going to put a fair bit of shock into your line as well. And so that's going to be another key part of it. And again, why fluorocarbon beats nylon monofilament. And then the last one is it sinks. So in the event that I'm working a crankbait very slow, that density is not trying to hold the line up on the surface of the water and making my crankbait run shallower than it otherwise would. The straighter the line is to your crankbait, the better off you are. So the overwhelming majority of the time, I've got trilene 100% fluorocarbon on there, and my normal crankbait rods are rigged with either 10 or 12 pound test. That's basically how it goes. The only variance from that for me, because even if I'm shallow cranking, the fluorocarbon will not pull the line down, pull the bait down fast enough. The bait itself will hold it up. And keep in mind, when you're shallow cranking, you can almost guarantee you that your bait itself floats, and so that will help with that. The only variance from that for me is braided line, and there's going to be a bunch of crankbaiters out there that are immediately turning me off. Oh no, you can't use braided line for crankbaits. It has not enough shock or not enough stretch to it at all. Well, if you go spend time in the lab at Berkeley's facility in Spirit Lake, Iowa, I can tell you that that's been tested, and the amount of stretch that a bass, let's say, is able to put in fluorocarbon during a fight is not significant, meaning that the give in the fluorocarbon is not enough to cushion much, like we all have been taught that it would. And the braided line has effectively zero stretch, and therefore it's even less forgiving. But that's okay, because it has a couple of benefits to it as well. First of all, braided line, I can throw the crankbait a lot farther. For a given equal equation, if I've got 10-pound fluorocarbon and I've got 10-pound braid on the same rod and reel, otherwise same rod and reel, I can throw it on the braid a lot farther, and that will result in more time in the strike zone or a deeper overall dive, as far as depth that the bait will attain. And a crankbait is one of the few things where the farther you throw it, the benefit it can be. There's not a lot of baits that is a benefit from getting it a long ways from you. But a crankbait's for sure one of those, especially offshore cranking, where making really long bombs with the bait gives you a chance to get the bait deeper or keep it deeper longer. And so that's one of the things that braid helps you with. Another thing is the braid is very, very thin for a given pound test. So 10-pound fluorocarbon is much thicker than 10-pound braid. And what that leads to is water resistance. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the bigger the diameter is, the harder it is to drag it through the water. It's not hydrodynamically efficient, to use a big word. So the braid is thin and cuts through the water really quickly. Even though braid floats, it is so thin that it will easily pull itself tight between you and the crankbait. The resistance of the crankbait will pull it tight. And so you get that. And then the one knock against braid is it doesn't have a lot of resistance to abrasion, and therefore a short fluorocarbon leader on the end of it, maybe 3 feet long, 2.5 feet long, to give you a little cushion right there at the front for one. Also a little bit of a visibility for two is a really good way to counteract that. And then some of you out there, particularly old school crankbaiters, are going to say, oh, well, you're going to pull the hooks. You're going to pull the hooks out of the fish. The braid is too unforgiving. It's too jarring. Yes, I agree with that. And that's an easy thing to counter. All you got to do is back your drag off just a little bit and keep your rod pointed less 90 degrees to the fish. So not straight at the fish, not 90 degrees to the fish, but somewhere around 45 degrees. to the fish. And by taking some of the tension off the guides, the rod's a little bit more forgiving. And then also by softening the drag a couple of clicks, the rod is more forgiving. And somebody out there is going to counter that and say, oh, well, then you're not going to get hook sets. Well, that's not true, because the braid is so crisp that you still get hooks. And anyone that's ever spent time around braid understands that it takes hardly any effort to get a hook set. So there are some scenarios where I will crank with braided line. And one of those scenarios is offshore cranking, when I really want to throw the bait a long ways. Like, for instance, my home lake has a bunch of offshore humps. They might be 15 or 20 feet to the top, and they're typically ridge-like. They're long, skinny humps. Well, if I can throw in an extra 15 yards because it's on 10-pound braid instead of 10-pound fluorocarbon, well, I can keep that bait extra, say, 10 of those yards down against the bottom where I need it to be catching fish. So it becomes an efficiency thing there. So that's one scenario where I will throw braided line. And another scenario where I will throw braided line for crankbaits is the rare instance of me throwing crankbaits on spinning rods. And the only time I do that is very small crankbaits, like very small, like a 0.5 size, which we'll get into, or with something like a Berkeley flicker shad, which is a very lightweight crankbait for a given size, and therefore it's easier to cast on a spinning rod. So I will throw it on a spinning rod, and then in that case I'll have braid on it for sure. And that's a very, very common scenario for me to throw. Being a multi-species guy, throwing flicker shads is the thing I do a lot, and I have a specialized rod and reel for that. And we'll get into the tackle here in just a minute. So to summarize real quick line, I would say 90% of the time it's fluorocarbon, either 10 or 12 pound test. There's a few scenarios where I'll up it to 17 or 20 pound fluorocarbon if I'm around more wood cover, more chances of getting wrapped, something like that. But in that scenario, you're going to be throwing your crankbaits a lot less distance on purpose anyway. If you're around a bunch of laydowns and wood cover, you're not going to be trying to bomb a crankbait way out there. So then I'll throw it on very heavy fluorocarbon. But most of the time, my crankbait's 10 or 12 pound test, try that 100% fluorocarbon. And the rest of the time, the other 10% of the time, it's going to be on 10 to maybe even 15 pound X5 braid with a short fluorocarbon leader on the end of it, and that fluorocarbon leader will be in the 10 or 12 pound range, same as it would be on the other rod. So that's my line. Moving to a rod, crankbaits like long fishing rods, and I'm in full agreement on that. My shortest crankbait rod is 7 feet long. My longest one is 8 feet long. Most of them are somewhere between 7 and 7.6. That gives you the casting distance for one. The longer the rod, the farther you can throw it. For two, it gives you a bigger shock absorber, such that if you picture a fly rod is 9 feet long, well, that's because they have to cushion 2 pound test. And so a big, giant, long rod helps with it being a big, long cushion for not losing fish. And then also the long rod gives you steerability and controllability. And that cannot be understated. Controlling your crankbait's direction with the rod. If I'm pointing my rod 90 degrees to my side while I'm retrieving, and I switch that all the way to 90 degrees on the other side, well, that crankbait's going to make a fundamental change in directions out there. And those direction changes, otherwise known as DCs by folks that specialize in them, will often create triggers for you. So the long rod gives you controllability as well. So again, we're going to be 7 foot to maybe 8 on the outside. If you're getting one, I would start with a 7 foot to 7.6 range, and then I would leave them there. That's what I would do. Then as far as powers go, they're going to go from medium to medium heavy to potentially even a heavy when it comes to super deep cranking. Although for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to leave that one out of the equation, because I would say 95% of the time, I'm on a medium or medium heavy powered rod, and that's based on the depth and the size of the crankbait. So the deeper a crankbait runs, the heavier rod I generally need it on, because the resistance of the bait coming through the water column. So that's the key with that. Then the other thing is it's a moderate speed or action rod. And what I mean by that, so when we talk about power, that's how much weight it takes to bend the rod, or how much resistance it takes to bend the rod. But when we talk about speed or action, we're talking about, and those two terms are equal, by the way, speed and action. It depends on who you're talking to. the speed or action of the rod is dictated by where along the blank it bends. So I could have a 7-foot rod that bends only at the tip. That would be extra fast. I could have a 7-foot rod under the same amount of weight that bends all the way to the butt, and that would be a moderate action rod. So my crankbait rods are all moderate or moderate fast, and that is basically a good compromise. Where I'm at moderate fast is on the shorter, more accuracy focused rods. So something like a square bill rod that I'm going to throw around cover. That would be a situation where I would throw a moderate fast as opposed to a pure moderate. Flip side is, if I'm just bombing them way out there, the moderate does a great job of cushioning either braid or fluorocarbon, and that's the way to go. Plus, you can really lob a bait a long ways. And you maybe mentioned in the beginning, I mentioned that I had maybe a 2.5 to 3 foot leader. I'll leave a chunk of line out of the end of the rod so I can generate the most amount of speed with that lure and throw it the farthest. And that's a key thing right there. So that's the deal with the rod. So moderate fast, 7 foot to say 7.6, maybe an 8-footer on the outside if you're getting real specialized with it. That's where that would go. And for the spinning rod, again, same thing. They're moderate fast for me with the flicker shad, and they're either moderate or moderate fast. They're 7 foot to 7.6, and I use specific reel for them. We'll get into the reels in a minute as well, but they're specifically designed. The rods that I use for crankbaiting are Abu Garcia winch series rods. They are designed specifically for crankbaiting. Every company out there makes them. Fenwick makes them. Everybody makes them. A whole bunch of companies make crankbait rods, and a specialized rod will help you. Real quick right here, if you're getting just one, I'm going to say get one that's 7 foot to say 7 foot 4-ish, and get it in a medium and get it in a moderate, and then start throwing that and get a feel for it, and then decide from there what you want. So medium power, moderate action, and then decide what your personal preferences are. But if I'm just starting out, that's the one I'm getting. Now, when it comes to reels, the reels for me are most of the time going to be a very low gear ratio. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to be somewhere in the 5.1 to 5.6 gear ratio range, meaning that the spool goes around 5.1 to 5.6 times, whichever the reel is, per turn of the handle. That's a very low ratio, and that is effectively the same as putting your car in first gear. It's got a very low ratio and therefore makes a lot of torque. And therefore you can wind very easily without the resistance of the crankbait. And if you have a lot of resistance on your reel, you lose feel, for one. You lose the feel of what that crankbait's doing in the water column, and particularly as it's hitting stuff. If you've got to wind it very hard, it also fatigues you. So in the same way that your car is very easy to get rolling in first gear, but hard to get rolling in fourth gear, well, the crankbait's the same way. It's basically you throw it in first gear and leave it there, and that's a key. There's a couple scenarios where I'll use a faster reel, and I'll tell you that here in just a minute. On the spinning rod, again, I'm using a winch reel, and so Abu Garcia makes the winch series or low speed reels in the Revo series, winch series, and you can get them I believe in the S and the SX series as well, but they're very low gear ratio. So you're looking at something less than 6 to 1, let's just say that, for an easy ratio. Now that's going to do great for all around crankbaiting. It's going to be a really good all around crankbait. Now I have some specific mine are winches, just I want to point that out. Mine are actual winches, not Revo, low-speed Revos or anything like that. Then from there, the other thing I'll throw out there is I have one scenario where I use a fast reel, and I'll use a 6.2 to 1, and then I'll use something in the Revo line, and that's going to be for square bills around cover, and that's a specialized form of crankbaiting. It's one of my favorite things to do, just for the record. It's also an excellent way to catch a lot of fish. A square bill crankbait around cover can be really fantastic, particularly if you're a good caster and good at line control. So in that scenario though, the reason I want the speed is that crankbait's usually cruising and like fast. It's not I'm not just nursing something along. I'm not trying to get it to dive 20 feet deep. It really just needs to run a couple of feet under the surface at full speed, and that's one of my favorite things to do. So in that scenario, again, I'll use the faster reel, but most of the time they're going to be a 5.4 to 1 winch, and that's going to do all of my heavy lifting. Then again, every company out there will make a low speed reel. The winch is specifically made for crankbaiting. but the others, they'll all make them as well. And again, I'll run the drag on the soft end. By bass fishing or walleye fishing standards, I'll run the drag relatively soft to cushion hook sets. Again, I have time to tighten if I need to, and if a fish surges at the boat, the soft drag, I can just use my thumb if I need to tighten it up. So that's my tackle as far as what I'm going to throw. Now, let's look at some specific crankbait styles. We're going to change gears here, get a little sip of water. And by the way, while I'm talking, I'm a little distracted. There's a deer looking at me out my office window right now. Kind of funny. It's that time of year where they're out mowing the landscaping down. But at any rate, one of my favorite crankbaits, got to start off with, has got to be the flicker shad. It's one of the most versatile baits ever. It's that style of bait has held state records and world records and line class records and everything else. Everybody will bite it. A flicker shad. You guys may think of a shad wrap, but basically it's a shad, kind of a shad-shaped bait with a long, skinny spoonbill and kind of a wide wobble to it, and it rotates on its axis a whole bunch, and it's just a very good multi-species crankbait. It is not a pigeonholed bait as a bass bait or a walleye bait or a white bass bait. It's also one of the few crankbaits that I like to run in open water, meaning it's not bouncing off of anything. And if you're a troller, you probably already have them, particularly a walleye troller. Flicker shads are a great trolling bait, and that should tell you right there how good they are at running in open water. But a number 5, 6, 7, somewhere in that range, flicker shad on a medium power winch spinning rod and thin braid and making long throws, great multi-species. Also fantastic for trout and shallow lake trout. So keep that in mind. White bass and wipers love them, and that's a great bait. So flicker shad is one of my favorites. I'll get them in a couple different colors, couple different sizes, and I have a whole box dedicated to them in my boat all the time. And again, that's the one that I typically fish on a spinning rod, and then even in the big sizes. So moving on from there, my next favorite is for sure a square-billed crankbait. And when I say square-billed crankbait, you say, well, I can't see you in this podcast. What does that mean? Well, it's basically got square corners. The lip is square across the front, and the corners are square instead of rounded. So what that does is make the bait more deflective, because those corners will hit something and make the bait roll up on its side. So let's say I'm winding this bait through wood cover, right? And there's a log, and I'm winding it along, and my crankbait hits the log. Well, the corner of that crankbait, because crankbaits run nose down by design, that bill will hit the log first, and it will roll up. It will lever the bait up, and therefore lift the treble hooks away from the log. So you have less chance of those treble hooks snagging the log. Now, here's an interesting caveat when it comes to the square bills. They're the one that I prefer, if I can, to work as fast as possible, because the faster you work them, the less snaggy they are. And that's because they deflect harder. When they hit something, it's counterintuitive. You think, well, if I wind it real slow, it won't snag. Well, that's not true, because it'll just barely roll on its side and the treble hooks will still hit. But if it's going full speed and hits the same thing, it's literally going to ricochet off of it and keep the treble hooks away from it, and you're going to get a lot less snags, which is why I throw the square bills on the faster reel, the 6.2 to 1 reel. And it's also why I throw it on a shorter rod because it's typically something I'm going to throw around visible cover. And if I'm going to throw it around visible cover, then I want to be able to be very accurate, and I want to be able to steer it. So it's a 7-foot, it's a moderate fast, it's got a fast reel, and I'm going full speed with that sucker most of the time. Square bill's one of my favorites. It's pigeonholed as a bass bait, but I can't even tell you how many walleyes and sawguys I've caught on them over the years, especially when they get around cover. Places like Glendo, when the trees flood, working a square bill through the trees, great way to catch walleyes. And nobody's doing it. You don't have to worry about fishing behind people, things like that. So a square bill is a really good call. I'm going to put that in the second position of my most favorite style of crankbaits. Then from there, I'm going to go to something more along the lines of a spoon-billed crankbait, something like a money badger. And a money badger, if you look that bait up, it's kind of got a true spoon shape to it, where if you just picture a spoon, that's what, you cut the front half of the spoon off, and that's what the bill looks like. And that leads to a big, wide thumping action. It also helps the bait deflect. It's not maybe as deflective as a square bill, but it's got a bigger bait, or a bigger bill, I should say, so that also helps with deflection, and something like that's a really, really good crankbait. So it's going to have a bill more similar to a shad wrap than a square bill, but it's going to dive deeper. And two things affect the depth of how the thing dives, or more than two, but two main ones. The length and shape of the bill is one, right? The longer the bill is, and the angle that bill comes off the front of the bait is one thing that dictates how fast and how deep a bait will go. The other one is the line tie. So if the line's tied up at the nose of the bait as opposed to out on the bill itself, it's going to dictate a whole bunch. And the line being tied to the nose of the bait helps with it deflecting off of things. So when I'm looking at like a spoonbill, something like that, something like a money badger, that's what I'm looking at, or a Berkeley dime. And again, I throw Berkeley stuff basically exclusively at this point in my career, but that doesn't mean I don't have experience with all of the rest. And I've thrown them all, and everybody makes some version thereof. I just know that the ones Berkeley makes are consistent. They've taken every bait on the market, reversed engineered it, and fixed anything that was wrong with it. And they're also affordable in fantastic colors with fantastic hooks. So that's why I throw them. But there's also other brands that make them, make no mistake. And you pick one you have confidence in and you go with it. But these work for me, and I know they'll work for you as well. So the Money Badger and the Dime are both excellent crankbaits as well. In the springtime, I like some of the old wigglewort style, particularly the old wiggleworts that you can't even buy anymore, like the old ones before they were bought by Rapala. That is a very consistent crankbait, but you got to buy them at flea markets and online, eBay, things like that. You can't go to the store and buy one. A current model wigglewort, you walk in Sportsman's Warehouse and buy a wigglewort, it is not the same as a wigglewort from 20 years ago because the molds were changed and they run consistently instead of inconsistently, which is the hallmark of the old wigglewort. There was a bait that came out for a while that did a pretty good job of mimicking that, but that subsequently got discontinued. And then there is one that Berkeley makes called a Wild Thing that does pretty good, and it's got a coffin bill, which is kind of a hybrid of a square bill and a spoon bill, and it's a good cold water bait as well, and it will hunt around a whole bunch. So those are basically the crankbaits I throw. I don't carry a lot of different crankbaits, and for the sake of this discussion, we're not talking about lipless crankbaits. That's a whole different genre as far as I'm concerned. They might be called a crankbait, but they sink instead of floating, and that's a fundamental difference in presentation. So we're not including those in this conversation, although they can be thrown on the same crankbait rod. So make no mistake, the rods I'm talking about, rods and reels and lines I'm talking about, work just as well for throwing a lipless crankbait, but the strategies, techniques, and stuff are different. So that's why I'm not talking about those here. But let's talk about crankbaits in general, scenarios for crankbaits. For one, speed is going to be really important, but it's rare that I wind, unless the bait's going full speed like a square bill around cover, it's rare that I just straight wind it. Usually I'm going to move the crankbait with the rod. I'm going to sweep the rod back as it pulls the crankbait, and then I'm going to wind the reel back to the crankbait at the same time. So the bait never really stops because I'm winding back to it, but I'm keeping tension on it, and that's a key thing. So I'll use the rod to move the bait a bunch, particularly if I'm trying to get it really deep. Or I'll just do a slow, even wind with the rod pointed at a moderate angle to the bait and a very slow, even wind. In pretty much every scenario for a crankbait, the rod tip is pointed down. The rod tip is down very close to the water, and in my case, most of the time, it's about 35 to 45 degree angle away from the lure itself. I don't want too far sideways, 90 degrees to the lure. That's going to give you no room for hook setting, and also going to sacrifice your feel and also put more resistance in the bait in the water. If you have it pointed right at it, you have no shock absorption even with monofilament hardly, and that's not a good strategy either. So I try to keep the rod somewhere around 35 to 45 degree angle to the bait and always down tight to the water. And the thing is this, if you feel the bait start to snag, let's say you're feeling it and it's ricocheting off stuff, which it needs to do, and I'm going to talk about that in one more second. If it starts to come tight and snag and you're sure it's not a fish, the first thing you want to do before you pull on it anymore is literally point the rod straight at it and give it like 3 or 4 feet of slack. If you do that, the bait in a lot of scenarios will float right up on its own. And I want to point out that you need to let it float for a good 5 to 15 seconds, because if you let it float and okay, it floated out, and you immediately go back to the reel, a lot of times you'll pull it right back into the same snag it was in. So you don't want to do that. So let it float. But the key to letting it float is you've got to give it enough slack, because the angle of the bill will dictate that the bait needs to go away from you to float up. It won't float straight up. Hydrodynamics will dictate that it doesn't. And you can demonstrate that by taking a crankbait and with no line on it and just hold it underwater and let it go. And you'll watch it will back itself in circles. That's because it's the design of the bill is forcing that. So if it starts to snag and you want it to float up, which is expert level stuff, and I'll do it all day long. You'll see a good crankbaiter do it all day long. That's really important, that you give it a bunch of slack and a little bit of time and let it float itself up, and then pull it gently for a second and make sure. Also point out, I've been bit about a jillion times in my life as the bait floated up out of a snag. So that can be something to keep track of. When the bait's floating up, watch the line and see if it's going to get popped right there. But I want to emphasize that in most scenarios, if at all possible, my crankbait is hitting something. It's hitting the rocks, it's hitting the dock pilings, it's hitting the down deadfalls, it's hitting the pole timber, it's ricocheting through branches, although that gets to be risky when you start fishing around too many small branches. Weed cover, as soon as it starts, I start to get some weed, I want to snap it hard and get the weeds off it. But I want it to hit something. That will trigger more of your bites. Crankbait's running in open water. The only time I'm going to do that is going to be something like a flicker shad, and usually at that point I'm going to steer it a lot. I'm going to move the rod back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, maybe even up and down a little bit to keep that bait moving around. Or I'm going to put blips in the reel handle, which is one of my favorite tricks. If you watch the best of all time, Kevin Van Dam, you watch him crankbait, he never just wind in a very rhythmic even. He'll be like wind, and in so doing that gives tiny little speed changes to the crankbait, and again, a way to trigger a bite, similar to if it's bouncing off something. If my crankbait's just straight banging on a dam, a dam face with a bunch of rock on it, then I'm going to just keep sweeping it with the rod and reeling back to it, because by sweeping it with the rod, I can feel the bait better. The rod's more sensitive than the reel, and I'm going to let it tick off the top of all those rocks and just try to keep it moving and let it ricochet around all over the place and get back to you. And when you do that, you're going to get a lot of bites. And I can emphasize that. Here's an interesting one. I was with Matt Reed, Major League, or no, who's he fish with now? I guess BASS. Not sure who he fishes with now, but at any rate, he either fishes at BASS level, which I believe is what he's doing. And I was with him on Falcon Lake in Texas, and he had a whole box of crankbaits, and one whole side of the bill was worn off of them. Literally worn off, like to the point where they weren't usable anymore. I'm like, what did you do to all those? Well, he's like, I like to have, when I'm crankbaiting, I like to have the bank on the left side of my boat or on the port side of my boat, and I'm throwing ahead of the boat and winding. And so what was happening was the right side of the crankbait was worn completely off because he was working gravel banks, and that thing was rooting all the way back to the boat. He said he was going through 2 crankbaits a day at the tournament on Bull Shoals prior to me fishing with him on Falcon Lake, because they were grinding on the rock so hard it was winding the baits down, and it was a straight crankbait bite. So he was throwing the crankbaits all day long, and it was wearing them down. That should tell you how important it is, A, that you have abrasion resistance on your line, and also that your crankbait is making contact with something. So for me, I can take a brand new, say a money badger, work a dam face here at my home lake, and by the end of the day, that bill will be significantly worn. And that's just because I'm banging it off all kinds of rocks and all that. Incidentally, if the bill gets worn enough and gets rough, I'll take a small file and I'll just lightly smooth it out so I don't have a chance of the bill nicking my line. And they're made with Lexan. You can file them very easily. Just be careful when you're doing it. So that's the key right there. So crankbaiting, bass fishermen, walleye fishermen, white bass, pike fishermen even, although I'm not a big fan of trebles and pike. I mean, there's just a lot of different fish that will smack a crankbait that's well presented, and it could work running full speed right into the surface all the way to just barely crawling on the very bottom in deep water and everywhere in between. So if you have questions, email me, Chad at fishfulthinker.com. If you want to join the conversation, please do so at fishfulthinker on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. You can check us out on Altitude Sports and Entertainment or World Fishing Network and see what we're up to on either one of those cable networks. We're airing in 7 countries at this point. And lastly, you can check out our YouTube channel at Fishful Thinker. You may be hearing this podcast there. If so, I appreciate it very much. And I please hope that you'll subscribe. It's a labor of love and we have fun doing it. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.